Hi, I'm Sharon from Evoca. In this video, I will show you how to create the basic SSS shader from the textures imported and applied to your model. So first of all, open up the UDK. Now, one thing about the SSS shader is you need to have DirectX 11 switched on. If it's DirectX 9, this will not actually work. So what we first need to do is switch the shader model to DirectX 11. So to do that, if you can come up to File, Switch Renderer. Now I've already got DirectX 11. Now DirectX 11 only also works on certain NVIDIA graphics cards. Luckily for us, the laptops do have the correct cards to accept DirectX 11. So if you've got DirectX 9, please switch it over to DirectX 11. Now what will happen is when you switch it over to DirectX 11, it will need to do a reboot of the engine. That is fine. Let it do its reboot. It will open back up and you'll be in DirectX 11 mode. And the other reason you can tell if you're in DirectX 11 mode is if you have a look at the top where it's got Unreal Development Kit, 64-bit, DX11. So this is how we can tell we're in DirectX 11 mode. So again, if you need to do an SSS shader, come to File, Switch Renderer, and make sure you're on DirectX 11. Okay. The next thing we need to do is we're going to open up the content browser and we need to go to where you saved your assets from previously. If you don't already have this open, remember, go into the UDK game content and right click on your package and fully load. You may already have it loaded. I, in this case, didn't. Okay, so we've already got a basic material. If you remember right, we imported the material and the texture from Max. And if we double click on material, it will open up the material editor. Okay. And it also creates the textures just in the corner. So all you do is you click on the first one, hold down the control key and drag it out. So this is what we saw when we imported Selena from 3ds Max. And now what we're going to do is we're going to expand on this and have it so it's a proper SSS shader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave these in here because it's already brought in the diffuse, the spec, and the normal map. So I'm just going to move some of these aside for the moment. So if you remember how to move stuff in a chunk, hold down Control, Alt, and drag your mouse, and it'll highlight. Hold down Control and click and drag out of the way. So I'm just going to click and drag these out of the way. Now I'm also going to disconnect them for now. To disconnect a node from any of the preview material slots, all you do is you hold down the Alt key and click where it's got, say for example, normal, click, and that will disconnect it. Likewise with spec, hold down the Alt and click on this little black here and it'll disconnect it. So we will come back to these textures a little bit later. For now, we will just work on the diffuse. Now, because she's only got one set of UVs, we don't need to tile this. We don't need to worry about a texture coordinate. So I'm going to delete the texture coordinate. To do that, just select it and hit the delete key. And it's gone. So we will work with just the diffuse at the moment. And we will be bringing in all the other nodes to make this shader up. Now before we begin, if you have a look on here where we hook up all our nodes, we have got subsurface in scattering color, subsurface absorption, and subsurface scattering radius. Now you'll see that it's grayed out. That's because we need to change the shader to be an SSS shader. So I'll just maximize the bottom here. Now make sure you have nothing selected. Just if you've got anything selected like a node, just click on the gray area to deselect everything. Okay. If you come and look down the bottom, I'll just maximize this. We've got all sorts of different options here. It won't always be expanded. So to actually turn on SSS, if you come into the D3, D11 node and expand, you have got Enable Subsurface Scattering. We need to tick this. So if we put a tick in this, If I move this out of the way, you'll notice these three options have become available. If they are not available, just make sure you come into your properties box, come into D3D11 and tick subsurface scattering. Now, the other thing I need to also select, because the eye, as I explained earlier, has been made up of two different parts. We needed to create an alpha mask so we could mask out the eye so it wasn't all white, so it would actually show up the colour of the eye. So the other thing we need to do is we need to enable opacity mask. And you do this from the properties of box as well. But if you click on material, you've got all these different options. What we want to do is we want to look at the blend mode. At the moment it's opaque, but what we want is we want blend masked. Once I click that, you'll notice opacity mask is now available. When we get to it, I will show you what we're going to plug into that mask so the eye looks correct. Okay, so these are the main things that we need to set up. I'll just move that out of the way. Now we can start creating our shader. So what we need to do is we need to make sure we can actually see the content browser and the material editor at once. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky for me because of the recording area, so I will just move things out of the way. So it's always handy to have the content browser on one side and the shader area or the material editor on the other, so that way you can easily go and click and drag on different textures that you might want to bring in. For the moment, we don't need to worry about any other textures just yet. So we have the diffuse texture, which I'll just make some room out of the way. What we are going to now do is add a few nodes. Now, the first lot of nodes I'm going to add allows you to modify the color. So if you decide, oh, the color that I've created, I want it to be perhaps a bit more browner, maybe I want it to be yellow, maybe you want it to be a green alien. What we can do is we can create parameters to allow you to modify this. So a quick overview on how to import certain nodes. So we're looking at creating a color parameter. Now in the material editor, there's different types of parameters. You have got a constant, and you've also got constant threes or vector threes. A constant is just a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever number you want it to be. A vector 3 allows you to have in constants with 2.5, 6.5, or you can also have RGB values, which is red, green, and blue. And there's also a constant 4, which is RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and alpha. Now, all we're worried about at the moment is a constant vector 3, because we want to be able to modify the color if we wish. So there are ways of bringing this in. You can come over to here where you got your material expressions, which I will just expand a little bit. And this has got all the expressions you can bring in. You have got your material expressions and you've got your material function library. Now the only ones we are worried about at the moment is the material expressions. So if I want to bring in a constant 3 for changing the color, luckily these are in alphabetical order and you can probably see it on the screen. Now if you couldn't see it on the screen, instead of wanting to scroll down, you can start typing in a name to search. So if I type in constant, I haven't even typed in the full word, it gives me all these different options that you can choose from. So I want a constant 3. What I can do is I can select this, click, hold, and drag into the scene. Or if you know what some of the shortcuts are, very simple. If I'm going to do a constant 3, I'll hold down the 3 key on the keyboard and click. And it's brought in my constant 3. If you want a constant, it's the 1 and click. Or again, just drag in your constant. So you will eventually get to know the shortcut keys. Until you get to the hang of the shortcut keys, just come over to the material expression and type in what you want. If you want to multiply, if I start typing in multiply, we have a multiply node. And I can click, hold, and drag that into the scene. Another shortcut for multiply is the M key on the keyboard and click. Not all nodes have shortcuts, but most of the ones you use all the time will actually have a shortcut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a constant vector 3. Now, the other thing we are also going to do is we're going to turn this material, this is a master material, we're going to turn it into an instance. What the instance allows you to do is make changes on the fly, and that prevents you from having to wait for the material to compile every time you've actually ticked this little green button that actually accepts your changes. As your shader grows and grows, it will get longer and longer and longer to compile. Whereas a material instance, once you've got your master shader, your master material, it does it straight away. So we are going to prepare this as a master material, and then at the end of it, we're going to turn it into an instance, and I'll show you the difference between compiling from the material compared to compiling from the instance. So because we're going to create this as an instance, what we want to do is we need to turn some of these nodes into a parameter. It's very easy to parameterize certain things. So, for example, this constant vector 3, I want to turn that into a parameter. To do that, you right-click on the node and left-click on Convert to Parameter. Easy as that. Now, when it does that, if you come to the bottom, it's got some options that you can change. Now, it's always handy to make sure you parameterize you give your parameters a name. This is also very, very important in any sort of coding, whether it's object-oriented coding like we're doing here, or coding meaning UScript or C++. Comment your code. I cannot stress that enough. The two things I stress the most, commenting and save, save, save. So, what this one is going to be is this is going to be the diffuse color, what we'll call the diffuse color. You can call it whatever you want, but try and keep it a name for other people to come in and go, oh, is that what that does? Nothing worse than coming in and going, what does this parameter do? And then you have to play with it, look at the model to work out what it does. So we'll give this a name, parameter name, and we'll call it diffuse color. Now, what the group does is this allows you to group it, so when you're in the instance, you can easily go to that group. So I'm going to call this diffuse. So any other parameters that I want to have for the diffuse, I will put that in the group diffuse. Anything for normal, I'll put it in a group called normal. Spec, in a group called spec, and so forth. And description, again, this is also good for commenting. This will actually show up a description at the top of this parameter. So I'll just call it diffuse color, if I can spell, and press enter. And as you can see, we've got our description, which shows up here. So as your shader gets larger and larger, as you scroll out, you can easily go, oh, okay, there's the diffuse color, and you can zoom into that like so. This also allows us to change the color. So as you can see, it's black by default. If we click on this black, it'll bring up a color wheel. And here is where you can change to whatever color you want. I'll just keep it as a gray value for now. Now that will be our default value. Again, in the instance, I'll show you later on how you can change that to whatever color you want. And this will tint the diffuse to give it a different feel. Okay, now what we want to do is the next thing we need to do is we need to multiply this. Now, we're going to multiply this color by itself just to give it a bit more oomph. So we want to bring a multiply. So again, you can come up to Material Expressions and type in multiply, or start typing in the word. Click and drag it, or M for Mary on the keyboard and click. Like so. So all this is doing is putting in the color so it's got a bit more oomph to it. So we will multiply it by itself and by the alpha. Now you'll notice you're seeing the multiply here, you see just a black square. What you can do to update the look on this is click on this little arrow or little box here, and it'll update. Like so. Not that we can see much difference here, but later on you will notice a difference. So if you want to see what's happening in each of these little nodes, just click on that little button and it will update the node. Okay, what we now want to do is we need to multiply this outcome with the diffuse. So, again, as I've said, multiply. Very, very simple. So I'll just move these two across a bit. I like to be nice and neat. And again, click and drag multiply from material expressions, or M and click. And we want to multiply the RGB of the diffuse with the end result of the diffuse colour multiplying on itself. So plug in the RGB with this multiply, and if we click here, you'll get an outcome. So to show you what I mean by this little box, if we come to the diffuse colour, let's just pick pink. You notice that it's automatically updated this little square. So if you can't see it updating, just make sure that that's on and it will update. Now keep in mind that you don't always want to have it on all the time, because as your shaders grow, it will start to lag memory wise. So I'll now just put this back. Okay. Okay, now if I was to plug this in from the multiply to the diffuse, it will also update here. As you can see, that's just changed it a little bit. It hasn't changed it much because it's more of a whitish colour. And if you want to see what it looks like, you just hit the tick and that will apply changes to original material and use it in the world. So if you were to then hit the tick and then have a look at Selena, she'll have those changes. But again, we don't see much of a change just yet. Okay, so the next thing we're going to bring in is a lerp, which is interpolate. And what this is doing is this is actually going to go with the mask. So if you remember, we created a mask for the skin. What the lerp does is it will look at all of this, the interpolate, it'll look at all of this, and it will mask out just the skin using that mask we created. Okay. So what we do to bring in a lerp is two different ways. You can either start typing in interpolate. So it's a linear interpolate. You can click and drag this over, or L on the keyboard and click. So what this does is this will look at A, which will be the diffuse. It'll look at B, which I'm just going to have as a constant because we want B to be just a constant color of black. And the alpha, which is the mask, masking out just the skin texture. So all the SSS does is affect just the skin and nothing else. And also, you'll notice with the diffuse color at the moment, when I change this, it's changing all of the sections. But what the lerp allows you to do is it will mask it out, and when you change this colour to say pink again, it'll just be the skin. It won't affect any of the clothing material at all. So we'll just bring the lerp in, move it to the side a bit, and we're going to lerp this, put this into A, the multiply into A, so click and drag into A, and we want to bring in a constant 1, which the constant 1 is going to be black, because it needs to work with the mask. So again, constant 1, either type in the word constant, if I can spell, click and drag, or 1 and click. Now we're going to leave this as a 0. Move that out of the way. Now what we're doing is bringing in the mask texture. So to do that, I'll just move this to the side. And because we're working on the body, if I go to my textures and if I go to the body mask. So to bring in a texture, you can either, one of several ways, I'll just move this to the side a little bit and bring over the material a bit. One of several ways. Click, hold and drag, like so. Or with that selected, come into your material editor, anywhere in the grey area, hold the T key on the keyboard and click. And that will bring in that selected texture. Now, if you didn't have a texture selected and you held down the T key, watch what happens. It's brought in a texture. And it's waiting for you to import a texture. So then what I can do from here is I can come here and go, oh, maybe I want this texture in here. So you select the texture. Where it's got none, you've got some options here. This green little arrow will actually put in this texture I've selected into this slot. So if I click this, and there we go. So there are several ways of bringing in a texture into your material editor. Okay, so now we have got the mask texture. We need to put in a few more nodes for this to be read correctly. It's only really another node. What we want to do is we want to bring in a 1- because we would like to flip these values around. And what the 1- will do exactly that, flip these values around. So type in the word 1, bring in a 1-. This is simple. We just hook up the RGB value to the outside, one side of the 1- and hook this into the alpha. And if we click on here, you'll see it's just rotated it around or flipped it around. That's all the 1- does is flip things around. Okay, so now if I drag this lerp and put it into the diffuse, as you can see, what it's done there is it's masking out the clothing and showing just the diffuse. But don't panic. I know it looks a bit strange. You're thinking, oh, but what about the clothing? We've still got some more nodes to do. I also want to show you that if we change it to diffuse color, it's changing just the skin in this section here. I'll put that back. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we want to add this or interpolate all of this on top of the body epidermis. And what that's doing is that's got the texture for the clothing untouched, and of course it's got a slight different tinge for the body epidermis. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the body epidermis this time. So if I move this aside, and the one that I selected before, which is body epidermis. So we have that selected, and you can click, hold and drag it in, or you can hold down T and click and drag it in that way as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in another lerp node, because we're going to interpolate this with this, using this here as an alpha as well. Because again, this alpha or this mask is only because we want the SSS to affect the skin only, not the clothing. So with that in, we'll bring in another interpolate. So you can either type in, again, interpolate, or L and click. Now, this interpolate is going into the A of this one, because it's not being used as an alpha. The body epidermis is coming into the B. This will bring back clothing. And now the alpha is just this one here again, because it's got the mask. Move that aside a bit. So if we drag this, we can hook this up to several ones, because this has got the mask and we want to mask out the skin versus the clothing. We bring this in and you can see it in here. And then this here plugs into diffuse. So watch what happens over here when I plug in this to the diffuse. You'll notice the clothing will come back. Like so. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is go through and name everything. Now to name a texture sample, again, it's easy, same as the diffuse color. Click on the texture sample, come into description, and I'll type in, let's type into Selena diffuse. Okay. I'll call this skin mask. And I'll call this skin epidermis. And as you can see, that is starting to label things nicely. Okay. Now, if I also change the diffuse color, only changing the skin and the skin only. And that is because we have created the mask, which we have lerped with the alpha of this and the color black, because we want to mask it to black. And of course, the skin epidermis is added on top to add a bit more color to the skin. And it's been created with an alpha, so it doesn't affect the clothing and plugged into the diffuse. Okay. So what we've learned in this lesson is how we can hook up the diffuse part and the skin epidermis to the material. In the next video, we'll continue and create more parts to put this into one big SSS shader.